and welcome to another episode of Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear. We're back to have another conversation with a change maker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable, healthy, and carbon neutral society. Our topic today are PFAS. PFAS is a benign-sounding acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which represent a class of chemicals used in food packaging and many other products that you often hear referred to as forever chemicals. The problem is, new PFAS are invented constantly and introduced into the food supply chain, despite growing scientific evidence showing that they contribute to cancers, immune system disorders, and low birth weights, among other things. One type of PFAS, called PFBA, is found in high concentrations in many packages and has been linked to severe cases of COVID because the chemical accumulates in the lungs. Our guest today is Kevin Loria, a Consumer Reports writer who recently published an article everyone needs to read to understand PFAS. It's called Dangerous PFAS Are in Your Food Packaging. Consumer Reports found PFAS in the majority of 100 food packaging materials they tested for this March 2022 article. They found that Burger King, Chick-fil-A, McDonald's, Taco Bell, and other restaurants use PFAS in wrappers for greasy items, while many grocery products contain them sometimes because the chemicals were introduced in the manufacturing process accidentally. Banned PFAS also continue to show up in new products, possibly because they're picked up from recycled materials, the environment, water supplies, or the soil during the production process. Conscious shoppers need to learn about and understand how to avoid PFAS. And you can learn more about the story at consumerreports.org. Consumer Reports is all one word, no space, no dash, consumerreports.org. Look for Dangerous PFAS Are in Your Food Packaging. Welcome to the show, Kevin. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, look, I've got a lot of questions. This is something I've been paying attention to for a long time, but let's start with the basics. What are PFAS and how did they end up in most of the products we eat?
Sure. So as you started to kind of mention in that very impressive introduction, which covered this pretty well. So PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, it's this large family of chemicals first discovered in the late 1930s. And it turns out they have a lot of powerful properties. They're resistant to heat, water, grease, corrosion, and friction. So in the decades since their discovery, they've been produced and widely used in a number of products. As you mentioned, nonstick pans, stain and water resistant clothing, firefighting foam. And they end up in products that we eat for two reasons. One is simply indirect contamination, because these chemicals are so widespread in the environment at this point in time. They end up in soil and in water. And because of that, they end up in crops and in our water supply and in the food that we eat. Mm-hmm. But they also end up in food because they've been intentionally added to food packaging. And that's because they can stop grease from seeping through packaging, which would be desirable on its own. But when it comes with this side of these chemicals that it turns out can be harmful to our health, it's something that I think that a lot of us do not want.
Now, you found this material in all sorts of fast food packaging. Tell us what kinds of fast food packaging, besides what's obvious from your previous comment that, like a French fry bag, what else do we need to look out for PFAS in?
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the things that's really interesting, and unfortunately, it makes it hard for consumers to kind of make an informed choice, just because these chemicals can be found in kind of any type of food packaging. We found that they are common in paper bags, in molded fiber bowls, but we even found them at high levels in certain items like paper plates in certain cases, or in we've mentioned, I think, burger wrappers, but there's also kind of the little cardboard containers that burgers might come in, or the wrappers that might come around a sandwich. So kind of all kinds of different things.
So if you were to take that food home, one of the things it's probably a good idea to do is take it out of the packaging before you reheat it. Is that one good idea to take away from this?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are certain things you can do to kind of limit your exposure to these chemicals. Certain factors make it more likely that the chemicals will migrate from packaging into food. Those include time and heat. This is especially important when food is salty, acidic, or fatty. And so definitely taking food out of packaging and making sure not to reheat it in that packaging is something that you could do to try to limit your exposure.
So how did grocery products compare to what you found in fast foods? And what surprised you? Because several of the things that you reported don't align with the brands offering the PFAS infected material?
Sure. So overall, I think that when we looked at products from, packaging from fast food restaurants and fast casual restaurants, about 30% of those products exceeded a legal limit that Denmark, which has pretty strict restrictions on the use of PFAS. About a third of the restaurant packaging items exceeded the limit that Denmark has, which is meant to keep intentionally added PFAS out of packaging. The products that we tested from grocery stores did a little bit better overall. I think it was about 15% of the products from grocery stores exceeded that Danish limit. That said, again, we did find PFAS in many of products from grocery stores, and in certain cases at higher levels, at levels that exceeded that Danish limit. There is a variety of things that we saw. So, we saw paper plates that were labeled as compostable that had levels of PFAS that exceed the limit that is supposed to be in compostable products, according to the Biodegradable Products Institute. We found, in certain cases, so Whole Foods, for example, is one of the retailers that has said that they've made efforts to get PFAS out of packaging. They had one item that exceeded that Danish threshold, although that threshold is 20 parts per million total organic fluorine. The item at Whole Foods was 21 parts per million, so it was pretty close to the limit. And in general, I think that we did find that retailers that have pledged to try to phase PFAS out of packaging tended to have lower levels, even if we did find it in some packages, some packaging from those retailers.
Well, they're probably not aware of this in its entirety either. And that seems to all follow from the fact there's no labeling requirements around the use of PFAS. Do you see progress in regulation of this material, or are we simply ignoring this, hoping that eventually we'll invent a better solution?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things there. One, as you said, it can be hard sometimes for them to necessarily know what's in there because there is incidental contamination. And we can talk about that more, but basically, because these chemicals are so widespread, even if they're not added intentionally to products, they still may often show up just because they're in machines used to make packaging, or they're in recycled paper. And if the source for recycled paper, so if packaging is made from recycled material, it may have PFAS for that reason. But when it comes to that question of kind of labeling or restricting use, there are steps being taken. Certain states in particular are taking the lead on saying, hey, we are going to try to establish limits on the levels of PFAS. We're going to try to keep intentionally added PFAS out of packaging. So California has a law that will be going into place next year. Their limit is not quite as strict as the limit in Denmark, but it's still one that a lot of experts say should help keep intentionally added PFAS from being in food packaging. Other states, including Maine, have laws that will go into place in the coming years as well.
Now, let's talk a little more about how it gets into packaging. You mentioned a moment ago the machinery might be contaminated, but why would that be?
Sure. So basically, as we've said, these chemicals are used for a variety of reasons. So in packaging itself, they could stop grease from seeping through, but because they can kind of, lower the friction, they might be in the lubricant for a machine that's used to make packaging, or they might be in the inks that are used to, print certain logos on packaging and stuff like that in the first place. So there are kind of a lot of ways for them to end up in this material. And the important thing about PFAS in packaging, I think, even if you have listeners who say, okay, well, I don't eat fast food and, I try to avoid these things in the first place, how much does this affect me? I think the important thing to know is that the production and disposal of these materials kind of adds to these environmental levels. And for many of these PFAS chemicals, our greatest exposure might be from our drinking water, for example. And so, the production of these types of packaging, the wastewater from those facilities ends up in crops and has been known to contaminate crops and milk from cows. And, once these packaging materials are disposed of, they end up in landfills or they're incinerated. And then these PFAS chemicals, which kind of generally either don't break down naturally or do so extremely slowly, these chemicals end up in water supplies. And so, even if you do your best to kind of say, well, I try to avoid fast food, as much as I can, so on and so forth, it's still possible you end up exposed to these chemicals because of their widespread use.
It also sounds like that a company couldn't really make a valid claim that their product or packaging is completely free of PFAS because of its ubiquity. Is that generally true? And does that suggest that the battle is lost?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that nobody should say that their packaging is absolutely PFAS free, and certain retailers are careful to say that their packaging is free from intentionally added PFAS or that they've worked to phase PFAS out of the production process. But like you said, these chemicals are ubiquitous. They're in, at this point in time, national studies have shown that they're in most of us. They are in the air that we breathe, and they're in drinking water in a lot of places. So, eliminating them entirely, is not something that retailers can necessarily say that they have done. As for the question of whether or not that means the battle is lost, I don't think so. I think that a lot of experts think that we can still restrict the use of these chemicals now. And, the chemicals that we've produced are still out there, still kind of accumulating in the world, in the environment, and in us. But, limiting the production of, new PFAS, especially for non-essential purposes like food packaging, is something that can kind of limit the exposure that we all have, which could have important implications for human health and the environment.
Do you see evidence that other states are going to follow California, or that the federal government is thinking about legislation or regulation of PFAS?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I think that a lot of experts would say we're seeing more movement to actually kind of restrict PFAS use from certain states right now. I think that there are 7 states approximately that have passed or implemented, restrictions on the use of PFAS, rules that they may not have gone into effect yet, but will go into effect in the coming years. So California, Maine, I believe Washington State. On the side of the federal government, the question is interesting, and I don't think that we're seeing as much movement. The EPA has talked about trying to restrict, or trying to restrict certain PFAS in drinking water, for example. But, a lot of experts are still kind of saying that, they need to be doing more, and they need to be looking at more PFAS chemicals than the select few that they're looking at. And, for now, the FDA as well, when it comes to chemical, these PFAS chemicals in food packaging, the FDA has said that, manufacturers have phased out certain chemicals that are known to be harmful, but we are not assuming that other chemicals that they've used to replace them are necessarily harmful in the same way. So we're not necessarily going to restrict them, which is something that a lot of experts that I've spoken with say, we should take a more precautionary approach. If these chemicals are replacing harmful chemicals because they have the same effect, it's reasonable to assume, until proven otherwise, that they could also have harmful effects on us.
The precautionary principle would be a wonderful thing to see us actually apply as a nation. In many cases, it doesn't sound like, from what you're saying, that we are anywhere near close to achieving a ban on this.
No, I think that perhaps unsurprisingly, at this point in time, you're seeing more movement in Europe to restrict kind of non-essential use of these chemicals. But in the US, it is still something that people are calling for, but is not, we're not there yet.
We're going to take just a moment to listen to a little advertising. We'll be right back to continue this conversation. We're back to talk more about PFAS with Consumer Reports writer Kevin Loria, who wrote the article, "Dangerous PFAS Are in Your Food Packaging." It's clear that regulation is going to be difficult or impossible, but why do we allow the continuing proliferation of PFAS being created in the labs? It just doesn't make sense. You mentioned that the EU is banning non-essential uses. So they're focused on things like firefighting foam. Why do we keep making this stuff?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that makes it hard to get a handle on PFAS and makes it hard to restrict them in certain cases is that, like you said, there are so many of these chemicals. So depending on how you measure it, you could say that there are more than 9,000 PFAS or potential PFAS out there. The number that are actually in production and use is smaller, but it's still in the hundreds. And so you're talking about hundreds of different chemicals, a few of which we know a lot about, a number more that we know something about, and some, more than some people would say. But there are still many out there that we know very little about. And so the question becomes, how do you try to restrict use of something like this? And what a lot of researchers and consumer advocates that I've spoken with would like to see is, they argue that we should treat this group of chemicals as a class and say, instead of banning 1 or 2 PFAS in food packaging, for example, we're just going to say that none of the chemicals that fit in this class should be in food packaging, just because it's so hard to, pin down, okay, this one chemical is in use now, but it could be swapped out for another one. And you want to avoid that kind of regrettable substitution effect where somebody says, okay, we're going to get this one harmful chemical out of something and replace it with something else. And then, 10 years down the road, you find out that the something else is also harmful in the same sort of way.
We do have a sort of retrospective approach to food safety and safety generally. What companies make PFAS? And are there shareholder actions underway to end their manufacture, perhaps, that would be an alternative route to ending their ubiquity?
So, in the US, at least, these chemicals were first discovered at DuPont and then later also made at 3M. DuPont spun off the chemical company, I believe it's called Chemours or Chemours, to make these chemicals. When it comes to shareholder actions to stop their manufacture, I'm not sure how much action there is in that area. I was looking at this and I did see, for example, that there is a lawsuit that shareholders have filed against Chemours or Chemours about the liability that the company will have for contamination due to these chemicals, saying that perhaps they underestimated or understated the amount that it was going to cost to clean up this contamination.
I can't even imagine how much it would cost to clean up this contamination. But so let's turn to a practical set of questions, which is, how do we avoid these things? What does Consumer Report suggest people do to prevent PFAS exposure?
Sure. So this is something, obviously really important to look at, and a few different things to point out. First of all, what a lot of experts would say is that it shouldn't be up to the individual to necessarily try to avoid all exposure.
Right.
That, companies and that make them and the regulators that we have really need to take steps here, just because this is one of those problems that is a systematic problem and bigger than any individual. That said, on an individual level, it still is probably worthwhile to try to restrict your exposure as much as you can. And so you look at the different routes through which we're exposed. So there's the direct exposure from products that we use, and then there's kind of indirect exposure from the environment. The indirect exposure that I'm talking about is, like we said, the production and disposal of these products adds to environmental levels, which contaminates drinking water, soil, even the air that we breathe in certain cases. So as kind of terrifying as that might sound, you can still limit your exposure here. You can test your water for PFAS, or you can see if your water utility report, if they look for PFAS, and if so, whether or not it's in your water. And if it turns out that it is, you can, consider using a water filter that will help filter out these chemicals.
Does that require a special type of filter, or is just a generally a carbon filter sufficient?
There are certain filters that are better than others for doing this. I know that Consumer Reports has looked at PFAS in water before. And so if you look for kind of Consumer Reports, PFAS water, we did a testing project, I believe, and basically kind of looked at both, where this contamination exists and what sorts of filters kind of do a better job at removing PFAS from water. I think the ones that do the best job are the reverse osmosis filters, but there are others as well, and I think that you can read about them on the website.
We'll find a link and include that article with the podcast. Are there one option? It sounds like you could use to at least reduce the chances of your exposure is to shop retailers that have pledged to reduce the use of PFAS. Are there brands that you should look for?
Yeah, so you can definitely try to avoid direct exposure by trying to avoid products that are known to have PFAS in them. So this includes nonstick pans or stain or water resistant clothing, or textiles. So rugs or carpets that are stain or water resistant probably have PFAS in them. Same for outdoor gear, but you can look, for example, for outdoor gear that is PFAS free. And there are movements to try to pressure outdoor retailers to try to reduce the levels of PFAS in their products. I believe that Patagonia, for example, has said, I want to say that it's by 2025 that their product should be PFAS free entirely. I want to confirm that to be sure, but there are movements to pressure retailers to take these steps. Within the food packaging arena, even in packaging from retailers that said they phased it out, those retailers tended to have lower levels. So places like Whole Foods or Chipotle or Sweet Green, I believe even Wendy's has made a commitment to phase out PFAS in packaging and had much lower levels than a lot of other retailers.
So another thing that a lot of folks will look for are labels that convey environmental friendliness. Do those claims provide any help in avoiding PFAS?
Unfortunately, claims of environmental friendliness on labels do not necessarily help limit your exposure. And so, in our tests, we saw that products labeled, eco-friendly or made from responsible sources, or even in one case, compostable, still had levels of PFAS that would not be allowed, in California next year after that law goes into effect. You'll also see labels on certain products that say they are PFOA free, for example. PFOA is a PFAS that's known to be harmful, that has largely been phased out of production in the United States in the first place. And just because it doesn't have PFOA doesn't mean that it doesn't have other PFAS chemicals. And in many cases, it often does.
Now, even if we were to ban PFAS, it's going to be there for a long time in our food, water supply, and the soil. You mentioned that it can take a long time, but how long on average does a PFAS last once it's been manufactured?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And, unfortunately, I don't think that we have a great answer to that yet, because these chemicals, with that name, forever chemicals, they generally don't really break down or do so extremely slowly. And I think when we say extremely slowly, you could be talking hundreds or thousands of years. You could be talking on a timescale that we have not seen since they've been made. So I don't think that the hope is that we're going to see them, necessarily. That's one of the reasons we want to limit production in the first place, just because waiting for them to naturally break down, we're talking about waiting a very long time. There are research efforts to try to look into ways to clean up existing contamination, but we don't have an answer yet on kind of the best way to do that. And so that's another reason to try to limit the production of new PFAS chemicals.
I'm looking forward to seeing what you cover about PFAS in the future. How can our listeners access this article and read it, particularly if they're not a subscriber? By the way, everybody, please be a subscriber, because they do great work at Consumer Reports.
Thank you. And in this case, this story and other stories that we do on topics like this, especially these environmental health topics that are so important, this is not a paywalled story. So anybody can access this on the Consumer Reports website. If you, I believe that you all will have a link, but if you're just to look for Consumer Reports PFAS food packaging, you would find this right away, and you should be able to access it no matter what.
Well, Kevin, great job on the article, and thank you for taking time to talk with us today.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
We've been speaking with Kevin Loria. He is a writer with Consumer Reports, and his recent article, Dangerous PFAS Are in Your Food Packaging, will be available through a link in the article that goes with this podcast. Once again, what we heard about is there is a great deal of innovation in the world. Chemists invent neat new chemicals with interesting properties that can be used in a variety of settings, but then they get deployed without us actually thinking about the potential future implications of exposure to those chemicals. An interesting new trend in chemistry, it's something I've been reading about in Nature in the last few weeks, is low temperature chemistry. As we heard, PFAS are made to resist high temperatures and therefore require high temperatures to be built in the first place. Low temperature biologically mimicking technologies, chemistry that doesn't require thousands of degrees of heat, but just the same heat that we live in the normal environment, could produce new materials and new compounds that react much better with living tissue as a result. So I suggest you keep an eye out for more information about low temperature chemistry. It could contribute to a safer world. And hopefully we'll also get chemists thinking more about the long-term implications of the stuff that they invent before we start deploying them in products, particularly in food-related products. But PFAS are everywhere, folks, and we need to get them out of the environment as much as possible. This is Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast along with all the others that we've done with your friends, your family, coworkers, people that you meet on the street. Stop them and ask them if they know what PFAS are, and then you can start an interesting conversation. And you can start a community, perhaps, and a movement to ban these materials. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.